Hello, and welcome to this NJCU Center for the Arts digital event. We would like to ask everyone to please keep your cameras and microphones off during the program. We will allow camera and microphone use during the Q&A section at the end of the program. If you would like to send questions during the program, you can do so via the chat window. At the bottom of your screen if you are on a computer, or possibly the top right if you are on a different device, you should be able to see an option for chat. If you click that, it will open the chat window where you can type your questions so that they may be read aloud and answered. To speak during the Q&A portion, you will need to raise your hand using the participant window, which can be found near your option for chat. To raise your hand, please click the blue hand button at the bottom of the participant window. This will let us know that you are interested in contributing to the conversation, and we will call on you accordingly. Thank you, and enjoy the event. Please note, the views and opinions expressed in this virtual event and presentation are solely those of the individual artists in their personal capacity and are not reflective of nor represent official policy, position, or views of New Jersey City University.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Stephanie Chaikin. I'm the director of the Center for the Arts at New Jersey City University. And on behalf of myself and Dr. Sue Henderson, I'd like to welcome you this evening to our program, Women, Aging, and Art. We have an amazing program this evening that is celebrating the recent publication of Women, Aging, and Art, a cross-cultural anthology. Its editors, NJCU Professor Midori Yoshimoto and Pratt Institute Professor Freema Fox Hofrichter, will jointly introduce the contributors who will provide a short highlight of their chapters. In the following question and answer period, the audience members are welcome to ask questions or comment. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Yoshimoto to start us off.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we are really honored to have you present here on this Zoom platform. And thank you so much for Stephanie and Justiana, Sabrina, for hosting this event tonight. This book grew out of the 2010 CAA College Art Association conference session, sponsored by the Committee on Women in the Arts, of which both Freema and I were members. Freema, of course, had a prior interest in this topic and then developed it into a session. Some of the speakers tonight presented their papers in this session and then subsequently turned them into the chapters of the book. I thank Freema for inviting me to join as an author and eventually as a co-editor. And we thank, of course, our contributing authors who are specialists in varied periods and areas of our history, and then who promoted our book event tonight. Thank you so much. For brevity of time, we will not give them full introductions, but share the link to their bios in the chat. I will do so shortly. And here is a list of contents of the book. Unfortunately, only one scholar, Megan Smetzer, could not be here tonight, but all the rest of us, 12 of us, are present tonight, and we'll be looking forward to your questions at any point in the chat throughout this program. Thank you. And in the end, we will also be glad to provide you the link to the 35% discount order form from Bloomsbury Publishing. Thank you. So I'd like to have now Freema Fox Hofrichter make an introduction to the book.
Next slide. Thank you all for coming. And I also thank Midori and our contributors for being so patient. As for several reasons beyond our control, the book took a long time to come out, and we've all aged considerably in the process. All these women are old, and these and later images are a good sample of the variety of media we incorporate: paintings, drawings, prints, manuscript illuminations, sculpture, photography, masks, and performance. There is art that is Western, but also works from West Africa, Asia, Pacific Islands of Polynesia, and the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest. The chapters focus on women from the medieval period to the 21st century. Represented are women who are poor, sick, strong, dignified, and who are queens. Stereotypes are explored as well as their origins, and then there are many surprising images. The subjects of some of the chapters are also women artists: Judith Leister, Lucia Maholi, Miwa Yanagi, and Joan Semmel. There are many depictions of old women in the history of art. This often comes as a surprise because until recently, they have not been the subject of art historical literature. They have always been there, but they were ignored, just as in real life. Next slide. The ancient Roman sculpture of an old woman is the first image in our book, and we ask how we know she is old, and then how old is old. According to Lynn Botello, 40 years old is the age accepted by art historians for the early modern period. Cultural historians use 50, and social historians 60. Maimonides said a woman is old when she is called old and doesn't complain. An image of a young woman suggests a future. An old woman implies a lifetime of experience, an unknowable past, and a future ending that may come soon. On the right is Vaikehu, queen of the Marquises, at age 76, near the end of her life, looking somber, perhaps resigned to her role as the last queen of her people. In the center, a detail of a 16th century painting, Death holds an hourglass indicating time is running out. He loops his arm firmly with the old woman's, slightly behind her, nudging her on. Her fate is sealed. But that old woman is not going easily and tries to take the younger woman with her. Both look rather grim, and only death is smiling. Old women have qualities that are mysterious. They can have sex without fear or penalty of pregnancy. They know secrets of birth and therefore of life, and as such, as can be seen as more powerful and sometimes frightening. Next slide. Old women were welcome subjects for artists. Painting with precise visual qualities of elderly women may have been considered a tour de force for artists, challenging them to explore the specificity of irregularities in the face, neck, and hands. How do you show subtle wrinkles or taut skin, wisps of hair, lengthened noses, and rheumy eyes without being derisive? Next slide. This is one way, with humor. Yes, Louise Bourgeois, the subject here, is holding just what you think it is, and a very big black one as she grins knowingly out to us. Robert Mapplethorpe isn't making fun of his subject. It's clear they both colluded to amusingly shock us. If she were 20 years old, it would have been a very different kind of photo, but she isn't. And because she is old, there is more to ponder here. Our book is dedicated to all the young women who may be anxious about wrinkles, and to all the old women who know better. Thank you. Next slide. Our first author is M.E. Warlick, Professor Emerita at the University of Denver, and her chapter and her talk is on Alchemy's Old Wives.
Next slide, please. The term old wives traces back to classical times, but it was revived in the early modern period to refer to outmoded and erroneous ideas, particularly in the realms of pharmacy and medicine. As for alchemy, most people are aware of metallic transformations, but alchemical operations were also used to produce plant-based medicines in order to create an elixir that would heal the imperfections of the human body, just as metallic alchemy was reputed to transform lead into gold. Images of women as practicing alchemists are rare, but those that do exist refer to the production of alchemical medicines. This first image is from a late medieval handbook of health, in which we see an old woman in a garden picking spinach. This text is filled with images of women of every age involved in the planting, harvesting, cooking, and selling of plants, and of administering healthy remedies to the sick. It is evident from these images that women were centrally involved at every stage of using plants to improve health. And while this image is not alchemical, it is a reminder that old women knew the secrets of plant medicine. Next. As we move into the early modern period and printed books on medicine and health, such images of women practically disappear. In this detail from a title page, we see two women in the upper right corner, that's the upper left corner, picking plants. The maiden with the long blonde hair may indicate the freshness and purity of the plants she hands to the older woman who wears a headdress. The two may also indicate the passing of secrets of herbal remedies between generations of women. At the lower right, a man stands beside a furnace, heating an alchemical distillation apparatus on top. Almost all images of practicing alchemists are male. Next. Similar figures can be found at the upper left-hand vignette, in which a man stands between two furnaces with alchemical distillation vessels on top. To the left, a young maiden sorts and prepares plants, again, her youth representing their purity. To the right, an older woman filters distillate into a flask, similar to those on the shelf behind her, which will be sold in a pharmacy. The very rare woodcut on the right comes from a Polish medical herbal, and it shows three women engaged at every stage of preparing medicines. The central older woman operates a bellows that heats a furnace with a conical Rosenhut cover, producing distillate. To her left, another older woman uses a cleaver to prepare plants and on the right, a third woman brings in a heavy load of plants from the fields. Together, these three women represent the old wives, whom the alchemical physician Paracelsus would disparage, even as he admitted that they often knew medicinal secrets that university-trained professors did not. Next. My final image of witches is of witches, as many of you may recognize. The surprising fact is that this woodcut was included in a large book of composite recipes, which has few other images of women. Rather, the book is filled with images of university professors, male physicians, and their male assistants. This woodcut shows three witches at three different ages concocting a potion under the direction of a demon in a tree, and it was placed in a section on treatments for melancholy. Witchcraft iconography is a vast topic revealing the increasing misogyny of the early modern period, stoking fears of female sexuality and suspicions of female vulnerability to diabolical influences. In the context of this essay, we should note the powerful emanation from the upheld cauldron as a parallel between witches' cauldrons and alchemical vessels used to produce plant medicines. Like images of alchemical distillation, witchcraft imagery often contrasts old and younger women, suggesting the secrets passed from one generation to the next. Such images convey the dangers of the remedies of old wives at a time when women as healers were being demonized within this era of rising masculine biases of mainstream medicine and pharmacy. Thank you.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Our next speaker is Zherka Filipczak. She is Professor Emerita at Williams College, and she will speak on Silence, Sidelined, and even undressed women in 17th century religion, which was also the subject of her chapter. Next slide.
The old woman in the painting before us does not stand silenced, sidelined, or undressed. Quite the contrary. She reminds one of the many male prophets who hold scrolls. But she did not remain in favor. Between the 13th and 17th centuries, 3 different subjects with old women as speakers of new religious beliefs underwent major changes. The presentation of Christ in the temple always featured the aged Simeon who holds Christ, and sometimes included a prophetess, the 84-year-old widowed Anna, who for decades lived in the temple awaiting the arrival of the Redeemer. She recognized him as Christ, and according to the Gospel of Luke, spoke of him to all that looked for the redemption of Jerusalem. As exemplified in Alvaro Perez's portrayal, in addition to her age, a scroll, a pointing gesture, and sometimes male listeners identified her for viewers of the altar pieces. Next, please. Images of Anna as prophetess flourished during the 13th and 14th centuries, while ecclesiastics respected the statements of female visionaries. But in the course of the 15th century, attitudes towards such women grew less receptive. The characteristics that identified Anna's speech as prophecy gradually disappeared or became garbled, and her popularity waned until she turned into a devout bystander or was eliminated from the scenes. Exceptions are very rare. Next. Pagan sibyls, whose prophecies were interpreted as foretelling New Testament events, became popular with the 15th century, though pictured less frequently and prominently than Anna. Old sibyls belonged to a numerically varying group in which the young outnumbered the old. This Cumean sibyl by Agostino di Duccio belongs to a group of 10, 7 of them young. Scroll in hand, book on lap, she raises her head and hand to foretell the coming of Christ. Michelangelo's muscular Cumean symbol on the Sistine ceiling remains the best known old sibyl, but they were then being supplanted by young sibyls who remained popular. Next. After Protestantism spread in Europe, a very different image of an old woman who spoke out publicly about religious matters became popular, namely Heresia. She first appeared in 1603 in Cesare Ripa's illustrated Iconologia, a recipe book of allegorical figures for artists. A fiercely energetic and almost naked old woman with snakes writhing from her head and book, Heresia stands for false religious ideas. She quickly became a much repeated image, especially on the title pages of religious tomes, some of which had multiple editions. Next. As the favored images changed, so did their audience. The prophetess Anna had a large, varied viewing public with people of all classes and ages, since churches remained her main location. The same applies to old sibyls. Heresia had a different audience, however, for although a few examples exist in churches, she usually inhabited the title pages of religious publications, relegated to their lowest level. Heresia's huge international audience remained limited to readers literate in Latin, men rather than women, and especially ecclesiastics, who supervised the religious ideas voiced by women. Thank you.
Next. Jane Crum will speak to us on a professor of art history at Purchase College at SUNY, will speak to us on anger, envy, and aging, early modern transgressive old women. Next.
I was drawn to the large number of images of old women behaving badly. and had a special interest in how this transgressiveness was interwoven not only with the standard effects of traditional scenes of the vices and sins, but more especially with the social discourses of the day. And I wanted to move beyond the standard misogynist imagery wherever possible to see how a basic iconography of essentialized unpleasantness had been updated to more current forms of gender and class bias. I first looked briefly at some of the familiar depictions of vice and the ways they fit comfortably with various gender formulations, such as angry young men demobilized from fighting, now unemployed and impatient, or young women in their youthful beauty, emblematic of pride. But I was more interested in the numerous variations from such formats. In this image after Goldschius, for example, we can see that while the vices are shown through the female figure, their ages vary, with the young woman representing pride, the middle-aged woman gluttony, and the central elderly emaciated woman avarice, demonstrating a kind of female life cycle rubric of the kind associated with conduct books and marriage manuals, and foregrounding an emphasis in concept from a solely internal condition to one with particular externalized outcomes. Next. Looking further at depictions of an elderly, often emaciated female avarice, I found the usual emphasis on miserliness and hoarding for that vice, oftentimes accompanied with suggestions of witchcraft, as here in the image by Callot on the left, were also linked to the idea of hospitality inverted, suggesting that socially important tasks of management and support had been abandoned. Much of the essay is devoted to depictions of envy and anger, both associated with states of roiling inner turmoil that erupt into invasive antisocial behavior. Envy, in Glover's Sneaky Poisoner on the right, casts the vice in terms of a contemporary fashion critique, but underscores the danger to others. Next. While anger in the form of Huys's enraged scold demonstrates the extroverted animus of the vice in a spectator threatening formula, these more close-up views reveal a deliberative treatment of aging on the skin, the dryness, the wrinkles, sometimes with continued exaggeration, but always with considerable attentiveness and occasionally exploration. Finally, I look at those pictorial elements that convey a greater sense of psychological focus, along with a heightened connection to the spectator, because these features overlap with certain important innovations typical of the era, and found in such outlets as depictions of peasants' facial types, tronies, characters excerpted in drawing manuals, such as this one on the right from Bleumart's Tekenbuch, as well as the half-length figure compositions of the Utrecht Caravagisti. Thank you.
Next. Paul Crenshaw, professor of art history at Providence College in Rhode Island, will speak to us on Frans Hals's portrait of an older Judith Leister. Next.
The 1668 estate inventory of the Dutch artist Jan Molenaar lists two portraits of the deceased and his wife by Frans Hals. Molenaar's wife was the painter Judith Leister. Earlier scholars have looked for extant paintings by Hals from the 1630s, when documents established personal interaction between Hals and Leister, and there are visual and stylistic correspondences in their paintings. However, Frima Fox-Hofrichter, our editor and host of this volume, rightly noted that Hals's paintings must have postdated the marriage of Leister and Molenaar in 1636. The couple left Haarlem for Amsterdam shortly thereafter and didn't return until 11 years later. Therefore, it makes more sense to look for the lost portraits among works dated significantly later in time. This pair of pendants from the 1650s may well be the missing portraits of Molenaar and Leister by Frans Hals. The paintings were separated in the 18th century, but today reside a short distance from each other in New York City. The man's portrait is in the Frick collection, and the woman is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. If I could have the next, please. I suggest that Hals was inspired in part by a pair of 16th century paintings by Hans Holbein from the collection of Lady Arundel that were in Amsterdam in the 1650s. Lady Guildford resembles the Met's woman in pose, tenor, and physical stature. I've suggested elsewhere that Rembrandt also visited the Arundel collection around 1652 and was inspired by these same works. The next, please. Molinar used his own likeness as a model repeatedly in his genre paintings. For example, the Frick portrait compares favorably to a presumed self-portrait by Molinar in Washington, D.C. And the next, we'll see that as we get close up, we'll see that physiognomic similarities exist in the nose, as well as the shape of the cheeks and prominence of the chin, the breadth of the mouth, and the substance of the mustache and curly locks. And the next, please. The girth of the figure in the Met painting presents a striking difference from the lithe, vivacious, and nonchalant self-portrait by Leicester from the early 1630s, which is also in Washington, D.C. One appears lively and young, the other somewhat dour and plain. The differences in body, clothing, gesture, and expression are easily explained by the passage of time, some 20 years or more, and for Leicester, 5 pregnancies that intervene between these two works. The next. Although there are differences in degrees of fleshiness, the underlying bone and facial structure of the two women is similar. If I could have the next, please, we'll flip the self-portrait, and the next again, tilt it slightly so that we get it at the same angle here. And we're going to overlay them. And now again, the next slide. As we overlay them, you'll see that they form a close match. And next, one more. This is now fading them into each other. The spacing of the eyes is almost identical, just a few millimeters off. The bridge of the nose is almost exactly the same. The angle of the nose is different, but the proportions are equivalent. The placement of the chin is the same. The contour of the jaw differs because the woman in the Met portrait is clearly more substantive in the jowls. But the crease between the cheeks and the nose, and between the nose and the mouth, is similar. The most telling characteristic is the mouth, with a glimpse of teeth evident and the upper lip slightly downturned in both paintings. And the next, please. We see it fade finally into the older Judith Leicester. And the next. In 2016, a new self-portrait by Leicester came to light that may well act as a bridge between her early self-portrait and the Met's painting. At the very least, it presents Leicester as a slightly older and more fulsome in appearance than the National Gallery's image. It may well date to the early to mid 1640s. And the next, please. This discovery should put to rest one of the central questions in studies of Judith Leicester. Although she did renounce her professional ambitions upon marriage to Molinar, she did not abandon the brush entirely. Thus, in Halls's portrait, we're likely looking at an older Judith Leicester, a heavier set woman with a more mature personality. Significantly, Leicester was not publicly presented as a painter later in life, whereas her husband was. Rather than seeking a perpetually young female painter, praising her ambition and confrontation of a male-dominated profession, we're forced to confront our own prejudices, favoring youth and beauty, as well as our desire to heroicize early modern women painters in contemporary terms. Halls's portrait, if this hypothesis is correct, commemorates a Judith Leicester who had moved on in her life from her career. Vita longa, ars brevis. Thank you.
Next. Diane Wolfthal, Professor Emerita at Rice University, will speak to us about Old Maids, images of elderly servants in early modern Europe. Next.
Being a servant in early modern times was often a temporary stage in a young woman's life between childhood and marriage. But for some women, it was a lifelong career. Those engaged in a large household sometimes rose through the ranks to become chief housekeeper. Others returned to domestic work when they found themselves in dire financial straits or their former employers needed help in a crisis. Because most images of female household servants show them as youthful, The few exceptions that represent elderly servants demand attention. My chapter examines 16th and 17th century images produced in Northwestern Europe that portray old women who perform such domestic tasks as cleaning the house, washing linen, and caring for young children. Next. Many representations of birth scenes, including this Swabian birth of the Virgin, show a servant preparing bath water, but none to my knowledge depicts the woman as so old or so clearly miserable. This servant readies the bath by leaning forward to grasp the handle of a pot of hot water in her right hand and test the temperature of the bath water in a wooden tub with her left. That she is elderly is apparent from her wrinkled skin, thin lips, and droopy tip of her nose. That she is an ordinary low-status household worker is made clear through a comparison to the other woman assisting St. Anne in the painting. The elderly servant lacks the keys and leather case that dangle from her colleague's belt, and her clothes are not bright red, but rather a drab greenish brown garment above a dull dark underskirt. Next. Most striking is the painter's depiction of the old maid's work, which must have been difficult for an elderly woman. She kneels on the ground, her back bent, her sleeves rolled up to reveal her bare forearms. Furthermore, her hair has come undone and falls in thin, stringy locks. Her arduous labor is underlined by her exhausted expression, her unfocused eyes, and her downturned mouth, which is slightly ajar, revealing a few teeth. Next. Independent portraits of elderly servants also exist. Two were made in England in the 1680s and 90s. King James II commissioned one, which shows Bridget Holmes, a 96-year-old woman who had for decades been the necessary woman for the royal family. Over 7 feet in height, this painting must have been depicted in part because of Holmes' extraordinary longevity, but it was also displayed in a public room in the royal palace to represent loyalty. Next, another elderly female servant was also depicted because of her extraordinary longevity, Alice George, a laundress or bedmaker of Wadham College, Oxford University, who was over 100 when she was portrayed in 2 paintings and a mezzotint. Next, Holmes and George were also portrayed because they represented the honor of the institution for which they worked. Unlike young, attractive female servants, it was assumed that elderly ones would not be seduced or raped. Quite a lot is known about George, who was interviewed 3 times, and she was clearly a character. We know a lot about her, but we do not know her exact birth date because she related, after she turned 100, she doubled every year. Thank you.
Next. Carol Ivory, Professor Emerita at Washington State University, will speak to us about Pettini and Viceu, Change and Aging in the Portraits of the Marquesan Matriarchs. Next.
My chapter focuses on 2 powerful Polynesian women of high rank and authority, Paitini and her daughter Vaikehu, whose combined lives spanned the entire 19th century. During Paitini's life and Vaikehu's youth, Marquesan culture was strong and vibrant. By the time Vaikehu died in 1901, it had become a shadow of itself, thought to be on the verge of extinction. Next. They lived in the Marquesas Islands, today part of French Polynesia, and Taiohae on the southern coast of Nukuhiva, the largest island in the group. Taiohae, with its magnificent bay, became an important moorage for Western visitors during the 19th century. These included military men like American Naval Captain David Porter, who made the drawing you see here of Taiohae in 1813. as well as missionaries, whalers, French colonial administrators, writers, and artists, including Herman Melville, Pierre Loti, Julien Viau, and Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote about the women and made portraits of them. Gauguin, by the way, arrived just months after Vaqueju's death in 1901. Next. The chapter places 4 of these portraits within the context of the women's lives over a century of calamitous historical and cultural change. It considers the similarities and differences in their depiction over time, and what role factors such as rank, status, wealth, cultural change, and of course age may have been at play. I use the drawing on the left to introduce 2 tropes standard in the early 19th century: the noble savage, which employed classical Greek and Roman facial features, poses, and clothing, and the dusky maiden, which depicted Polynesian women regarded as sexually free, as exotic, sensual, and other. For example, going topless was certainly normal for Polynesian women, but featuring breasts in drawings became commonplace even when women had covered themselves with capes or cloaks. The drawing on the left was made by the same Captain Porter we saw above, and the woman may or may not be Paitini. Porter was enthralled by her, then a teenager, in 1813, but he says she coldly rebuffed him. The second drawing of a different woman made earlier in 1804 and published as an engraving in 1813 is instructive in showing her breasts covered by a cape in the original drawing and similar to the trope, but uncovered in the engraving, consistent with the dusky maiden trope and similar to Porter's drawing. It's hard to tell her age, but her tattoo and the ear ornament in the drawing mark her as a woman of rank and wealth. Even so, she becomes exoticized and sensualized. Next. In 1838, 3 artists, part of the French fleet visiting Taiohae, made drawings of Paitini, then the highest ranking woman on the entire island. She was in her early 40s, considered old, and soon to become the quote unquote Dowager Queen. In the original drawing by Goupil on the left and the engraving after Luguillau's drawing on the right, the breasts are covered, but her tattoo is prominent. In the striking central image, an engraving after a drawing by Le Breton, Paitini's otherness is signaled by her tattoo, but also her darker skin and fully bared breasts. An interesting addition is the woven fan that marks her high rank. Was its inclusion the artist or engraver's idea, or Paitini's, exerting her own agency in proclaiming her status or pride in her culture? She is here dignified, yet still exoticized, transformed into a dusky matriarch. Next. The first portraits of her daughter Vaqueju are from the early 1870s, when she was in her late 40s. In the later photo on the right, taken in 1899, she was about 76. She was often described by Westerners as rather simple-minded, yet always dignified, very mistaken, actually, take on her. Among Marquesans, she retained authority and influence. By this time, major cultural change had taken place. Long converted to Catholicism, she now wears the modest dresses introduced by the missionaries. She is no longer the dusky maiden or matriarch, but in the 1872 Loti drawing, her otherness is still indicated by her tattoo, fan, and the tropical setting that includes a wooden tiki or ancestor figure. In the 1899 photo, she sits in front of a paipai, a customary stone platform, with her tattooed arms, now faded, stretched forward. Were these her choices or those of the artist or photographer? With her quiet dignity, is she signaling resignation, resistance even, perhaps to being photographed, or resilience in reaching old age? We don't know, but it's a powerful image in its quiet way. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Vanessa Rocco, Associate Professor of Humanities and Fine Arts in Southern New Hampshire University. And she'll be speaking to us about Old Women, New Vision, Lucia Mohori's photographs of Clea Zetkin.
Next. Thanks. Known primarily for her Bauhaus object and architectural photography, Lucia Moholy's portraits challenge critics and historians. While many have aligned her portraits with the same objective, quote unquote, principles she used in her product-based images, many of the portraits concurrently allow a great deal of humanity to emerge. This was particularly true of her extensive series of radical socialist politician Clara Zetkin. A writer, editor, women's rights activist, legislator, and champion of leftist causes since her youth, Zetkin was nearing the end of her days at her sitting with Moholy around 1930. A meeting arranged by Moholy's then partner and Zetkin's political ally, Theodor Neubauer. And just a pre-apology that he's in the last slide, so I'll show you him later. My chapter demonstrates how Moholy's use of stylistically innovative angles for her subject's face, hands, as well as close cropping, all characteristic of the new vision photography she had developed with her husband, the Bauhaus master Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, succeeded in conveying Zetkin's life of labor, her pensiveness, and her standing as a political and intellectual powerhouse. It thus attempts to redefine the concept of idealization and heroicization in photographic portraiture away from one based on surface physical perfection. Zetkin, as an old woman, is ideal for this exploration. It also shows that the visual innovations of the new vision, which are still often analyzed through strictly formal means, can indeed increase the viewer's empathic engagement with the subject. The portraits of Zetkin make this case more convincingly than others in Moholy's oeuvre. This is all the more powerful due to the political nature of the subject and previously underexplored visual connections between Moholy's work and the worker photography movement. The strongest set of images from the sitting are closely cropped profiles, one from above and a close-up of her hands, which I'll show in a moment. In her sittings, Moholy often took one shot with her subject's eyes closed, like the one on the right, an unsurprising nod to pensiveness given that her sitters tended to be artisan intellectuals. This image on the right is one of the most indicative of her New Vision style, where the viewer might be caught off guard by the unexpected twist on the three-quarter view. From this elevated stance, it offers a completely different view of the face than one normally has access to, and thus unusual details come to the fore. The wrinkled forehead from Moholy's chosen angle seems almost three-dimensional, as if rendered with impasto paint. And the whiteness of most of her hair is highlighted by the contrast with the unruly bun that appears to still be black. This is not a woman who overly prioritizes her appearance. Her bulky and wrinkled clothes are visible in many of the shots in clashing patterns, almost to the point of humor, but clearly worn for comfort. Next. Then the hands underscore why this is, because she is and has been preoccupied with other labors. They are clenched, wrinkled, and appear hard-worked. This close-up of the hands resembles worker photography in many ways, a contemporaneous movement supported by the Communist Party that emphasized working-class subjects, the tools of their trade, and the facts of their work. First appearing in the USSR in the mid-1920s, Willy Munzenberg, backed by Comintern, expanded the movement into interwar Germany in a highly programmatic way. The movement had programs that included distribution of cameras to the working class, lessons, and magazine outlets such as AIZ. Fertile ground for worker photo offshoots also sprang up in Mexico, the United States, and other European outlets. As mentioned earlier, this was a body of photography that was admired enough by New Vision pioneers such as Moholy-Nagy that it was included in New Vision instigated exhibitions like Film and Photo. And Lucia Moholy certainly would have been well aware of the worker movements, tropes, and iconography. Some of the most recognizable worker photography is comprised of a series of laborers' hands undertaken by Tina Medoni in Mexico. Workers' hands on the right is a standout. The close cropping of Zetkin's hands monumentalizes them, as does Medoni's workers' hands, in more of a comparison of form. And the folded hands, gnarled knuckles, and use of shadow emphasize the hands as instruments of work. Zetkin is an intellectual, a writer. Her hands are folded in a manner similar to a student on a desk or a teacher during a debate. They are the vessels of her work, no less than the shovel in workers' hands. And Moholy monumentalizes these old hands by amping up the new vision techniques at her disposal. Thank you. Last slide is Neubauer, just a quick view. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Vanessa. Next. Our next speaker is Johanna Ruth Epstein. She's a New York-based art historian and critic. She's presenting on the theme, a sculptor hostess, which Louise Nevelson's boxes.
Thank you. We on the title slide? I am thrilled to be here in the company of these formidable scholars and thinkers. Thank you, Freema and Midori, for going way above and beyond to push this chapter to completion. At one point, you offered to come and babysit for me so I could finish. I get the sense you were absolutely serious. My chapter started as a seminar paper for Linda Nochlin over 20 years ago, and I've since drifted away from the academic world into motherhood and into grant writing. But before that, I was a professor at a women's college, and I think one of the reasons that women are drawn to art history is that it gives them permission to look and think critically about the world instead of worrying about how the world sees us. Next. My chapter is on Louise Nevelson, an older woman who achieved success as a sculptor in the 1950s, when women were thought incapable of great art, especially sculpture. And we're looking at two publicity shots from 1979 and 1958, respectively, of Nevelson and Constantine Brancusi, both titans of modernist sculpture at the end of their careers. It inspired the thoughts in my chapter because the contrast between them is so striking. Nevelson, the sorceress, and Brancusi, the artist next door. And for me, it's emblematic of the role that Nevelson had to play in order to be a successful artist. Next slide, please. In my chapter, I argue that Nevelson developed a persona in her 50s to combat the invisibility that threatens women beginning in middle age. Here she is standing in the kitchen of her New York apartment in 1954 behind one of her sculptures, which is an imposing column surrounded by spiky shards. And it's amazing to me that the critics of her time seem to have missed what her work actually is, which is smashed up household objects wrestled into modernist forms. It's a literal subversion of the accepted role for a 1950s woman: housekeeper, caretaker, mistress, muse, never first, always second. I mean, this work is called first personage. It's not subtle. And I just love this photograph. She's looking at us, looking at her work. I like to think she's contemplating her next move. She was a great admirer of chess, and some of her works are even named after chess pieces. Next. And here she is a year later in the over-the-top witchy guise that she embraced for a Life magazine issue that accompanied a major exhibition of her work. Paradoxically, the absurdity of her persona shows how serious she was about making art. She refused to become invisible, even if it meant leaning into a negative stereotype that was the societal lens through which she was already seen. So for many reasons, the issues that are raised in this book are even more central to me now that I myself am older, and younger generations brought up on social media are dealing with a kind of obsessive self-focus that obstructs a clear vision of themselves and each other. So how can feminist art history help reshape the conversation? I think it can help us seize opportunities like this one, this book, to look, to make our own environments and to broaden the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Our next speaker is Dr. Susan Card, Professor of Art, Architecture and Design and Africana Studies at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. She'll be speaking to us about museums and the Missing Women of Sandy. Suzanne?
Thank you. Next slide, please. I want to take a brief moment to remind those of us who are used to seeing objects of art in a museum that that is not the original location for many of these works of art, nor were we the intended audience for many of them. A lot of the objects we've seen already this evening were religious, spiritual, in manuscripts, had a limited viewing audience. And ending up in a museum, while it's a fabulous way for us to have access to these ancient objects, means that we have to back up and understand the context in which they were made. And this is definitely the case with African objects. As an American scholar working in the United States, what I have always found is that I need to start with the museum in order to explain to my students that their ability to consume these objects and these histories is very different from the one for which they were made. And in the case of African wooden objects, museums have not done us a lot of favors. That's not necessarily their fault, but one of the issues that I attack in my article is that museums in their exhibition of African objects are frequently unable to tell an entire story about the original context because that story has been stripped and the objects have been stripped and removed from their context. So in looking at these two sculptures, we're looking at one tiny component of what is a much larger ensemble, and that is the ensemble of the Sowe, okay, or the Senior Sande woman, who was a leader for other women in society in her home country, which is now referred to as Sierra Leone and Liberia. At the time that these women were alive and using these objects themselves, these areas were under British colonization. And so you're looking at two wooden masks. The one on the left was made by the artist Pasima. And on the right, this is an object that we don't know the artist because the artist information was not collected with the object. The one on the left is in the United States and the one on the right is in the British Museum. And both of them display women. The one on the left displays a young woman and the one on the right displays an old. That's almost impossible to tell unless you understand the role that elder women play in this society. Next slide, please. This is what's missing. These are two pictures from the 1890s that show the full ensemble of the Sowe, or the older woman in her masquerade dress costume. And this ties into a couple of issues that have already been mentioned for us, that during the colonial period, whether it's the Marquesas Islands or whether it's West Africa, women and women's dress and women's bodies were very much the subject matter and point of interest for a lot of the European scholars who were most frequently men. And so they were drawn to how differently women looked in these societies and how differently they acted from European women. And in the case of the Sowe that you see here, this ensemble is a wooden headpiece that sits on top of the woman's forehead, usually coming down just to cover her eyes. And the rest of her body is covered in this black raffia fiber. And that fiber is sewn onto a man's shirt and man's pants. And in the picture on the right, you can see that the women are actually wearing men's shoes. The woman on the left is not wearing shoes, but rather stockings. And what this symbolizes is that for these women who were their elder sort of leaders in society, is that they were able to usurp men's clothing, in other words, the realm of men, for the power and the benefit of women. And one of the important roles that they had in society was the training of younger women, and the training of those women to become adults, to go through puberty, to become married, to have skills that they needed to survive and give birth and become old women themselves. The reason that this older picture matters, or that it matters to museums that these older women are involved with these masks, is that they were the commissioners of them. They commissioned the artists to make them for them. They commissioned the design and the way they wanted their masks to look, and essentially drove an entire genre of what we now consider art objects. And these are women that in many cultures we would, again, as was already mentioned, women would essentially be invisible. They wouldn't necessarily be part of our visual world. The reason that museums care about the way their objects are depicted, and if we could actually go back one slide, if that's possible, to the masks themselves, is that this is all we're left with. We don't have the costume, we don't have the woman's body. And as a result, the conversation tends to focus on the moments at which these masks were used and not the women who wore them. And these masks were used at the end of initiation ceremonies for young women to celebrate their entering into puberty. That matters because of the fact that initiation ceremonies in West Africa amongst the Sande society, which is the women's society for whom these masks were made, frequently included genital surgeries for the young girls. And this now in 21st century kind of global politics has become a very difficult issue to discuss, similar to things like abortion and rights for women regarding the hijab and the wearing of the veil, because this has been named now as female genital mutilation, or FGM. But that term is only used, I find, in literature that refers to women from low to middle income countries or women whose skin does not look like mine. In other words, the darker skinned woman. And the language that gets used for white women, on the other hand, is the language of vaginal surgeries. We have labiaplasty, we have clitoroplasty. The Cleveland Clinic provides the exact same surgeries to anyone who would like to go that these women actually performed on their own young daughters. And the terms clitoral recession and reduction clitoroplasty are used, not female genital mutilation. So in my article, what I talk about is how museums can deal with this language because of the fact that when these objects are exhibited, someone will undoubtedly point out in the press that they were part of a ritual that condoned FGM, or female genital mutilation. What I argue is that we need to step back and examine the biases of that language, and that we need to examine how elder women were using genital surgeries to allow their daughters their own place in society as they themselves aged. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. Next,
You can
please.
skip that one.
Our next speaker is Rachel Middleman. She's Associate Professor of Art History at California State University, Chico. She'll be speaking to us about Aging and Feminist Art, Joan Sammel's Visible Bodies.
Thank you. The idea for this chapter developed after seeing an exhibition of Joan Sammel's new work in the spring of 2013, in which she confronted audiences with large-scale paintings of a nude aging body. In Transitions, the painting here and on the cover of our book, she juxtaposes 5 images of herself, precariously positioned and unclothed, her long gray hair clearly visible against a loosely painted field of bright oranges and greens. Like a series of photographs taken in quick succession, the multiple bodies overlay one another, conveying motion and fragmentation. This work, in which Semmel appears as an old woman, extends and transforms her career-long practice of using her own nude image to challenge visual representations of women in art and popular culture. Since the 1970s, the nude self-portrait in particular has offered Semmel a highly personal and individual strategy for investigating female experience and challenging objectification within the broader feminist project of claiming rights to female agency and expression. Next slide, please. In 1970, she returned to New York after living in Spain since 1963 and transitioned from an abstract expressionist style to figuration, first with a series of large-scale paintings of male-female couples engaged in sex. This was in response to the abundance of sexual imagery she saw in American visual culture that didn't speak to her experience. Next, she turned her gaze to her own body, constructing compositions as if looking down from her perspective, quite different from a traditional self-portrait in which the artist's eyes meet the viewer's. In paintings like Me Without Mirrors, which she refers to as self-images, one is offered a first-person point of view with the aid of a camera rather than a mirror. The distorted perspective from which we see the body exaggerates the physical awkwardness of bunched up skin and strained muscles. Next slide, or actually skip to the next one for time. In Recline, the nude figure is cropped in a dramatic close-up view from thigh to shoulder and fills the majority of the canvas. We find a multiplicity of subtle colors in her skin and the cumbersome breasts and the wrinkles forming around her chest and arms. She communicates the pliability and temperature of flesh. At the upper left corner, instead of the artist's face, we see her hand holding a camera with its lens pointed at us. Unlike her earlier compositions that created the illusion of Semmel's point of view, the inclusion of the camera in Recline makes apparent that she offers her viewers self-portraits constructed through the use of devices, in this case, both the camera and the mirror, that produce their own versions of reality. Through analysis of how her portraits make visible a corporeal presence that is invisible in a culture that fetishizes youth, her work reveals that images of the body are still of critical relevance to contemporary feminist art, and demonstrates the continued impact of Semmel's generation of artists, which includes a number of women who used their bodies as material in the 1970s and continued to do so after they reached an age when exposing their bodies was again socially unacceptable, this time due to age. Next slide, please. The painterly brushstrokes and multiple figures in Semmel's recent work create a sense of movement, emphasizing this old body as an active living presence. In my chapter, I discuss this in terms of ideas about an artist's late work and anti-aging culture. The fact that older people are judged on a middle-aged quality of life standard and on outward appearance. Semmel's paintings pose an alternative to the visual culture we experience daily from the anti-aging industry. It's these circumstances in which Semmel's paintings become oppositional. In her large canvases, the old woman's body is suspended in visibility, layered, amplified, and multiplied through the medium of paint. And in this last example, Red Line from 2018, you can really see the visual play between the representation of the figure and the texture and color of paint. I'll end there, but I wanted to mention that her retrospective, Joan Semmel's Skin in the Game, is currently on view at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, so I hope you'll be able to see that. Thank you.
Next. I thought I should introduce Midori Yoshimoto, who you've already met before. She is Associate Professor of Art History at New Jersey City University and responsible for arranging this webinar book launch. Her topic is Darkness of Girlhood and Lightness of Aging, Miwa Yanagi's Transcendental Old Women. Next.
Thank you, Frima. In the 1990s, Miwa Yanagi became known for a series of color photographs of young women in uniform, so-called elevator girls. By 2000, however, she had shifted her interest to old women. Calling Japan a big grandma nation, Yanagi recognizes that older women are now becoming the influencers. On the other hand, the young girl worship persisting in Japanese subculture presents a contradiction. Yanagi turned this dichotomy between youth and age into an underlying theme in her work. In one of her fairy tale series, Sleeping Beauty, next please, a young girl is seen holding down an older woman with a mask of a hag, possibly most likely representing a witch or clone archetype. The Japanese exhibition title in which this was shown, Shoujo Jigoku Gokuraku Rojo, literally meant girls' hell and old women's heaven, which was translated into a darkness of girlhood and lightness of aging in English. In Yanagi's fairy tales, the younger protagonists may be taken over by darker thoughts and trapped in a living hell. Next, please. Yanagi invented her own fairy tale entitled Suna Onna, Sand Woman. It is a series of photographs and video about young girls searching for Suna Onna. Suna Onna turns out to be a mythical being with an old woman's arms and young girl's legs who traveled in a small tent to tell stories. While sand keeps Snaona alive, she must also keep sweeping it with a broom so that the sand does not consume her. One day she was gone and only sand remained. In the end, Grandma told the girl, Snaona is everywhere, but not everyone can find her. Snaona lives in people's hearts. Here, Snaona may represent innocence or true self, which becomes undermined and lost as a girl grows up and faces the realities of a patriarchal culture. This tent woman is reminiscent of Femme Maison, next please, by Louise Bourgeois, next please, where an upper half of a female body is covered with a house. Like Bourgeois, Yanagi may be commenting on the traditional societal confinement of women to the domestic sphere. She also stated that closed spaces like tent on an elevator symbolize the world she finds herself in. The tent, therefore, is reflective of the marginalized space and societal oppression of women, which is often hidden away from view. Compared to the darker overtone of the fairy tale photographs, next please, Yanagi's theatrical works are filled with satire and comedy. In 2010, for example, Yanagi produced Cafe Rottenmeier as part of Festival Tokyo. A dozen Japanese women of varying ages dressed up to look like the middle-aged governess character, Mrs. Rottenheimer, from the 1970s anime Heidi. Next, please. As a parody of the popular maid cafes in Tokyo, next, please. Next, where young women dressed in French maid uniforms to serve their mostly male customers, Yanagi's Cafe Rottenmeier critiqued the strong ageism against women in Japanese society. These unsmiling governesses would admonish customers who are not sitting straight or forcefully involve them in a cooking demonstration. Speaking to the reason why these women volunteered to play a role of an old maid, Yanagi explained, grandmothers are free. There is an expectation in this world that women have to be young and beautiful, but grandmas are liberated from such an obsession. Contrasting with the confined, gloomy world inhabited by elevator girls, Cafe Rottenmeier became a lively space filled with chattering, singing, and dancing. By subverting stereotypes surrounding older and young women, Yanagi has illuminated how these tropes are constructed and reinforced in everyday life and popular culture. Thank you. Well, now we would like to move on to Q&A. I know some of you might have to leave, but I shared you the link to the discount form for the book if you're interested. Is there any question? Let me see.
There's a question for you, Midori, about Yanagi's work might be reverted to the female unnamed character in Abe Kobo's Woman in the Dunes.
Yes, definitely. I think Abe Kobo is one of her inspirations. She, in fact, also was interested in Hako no Otoko, I think the boxman, for possible, inspiration for Snaona. Thank you for that.
There was a question that I think Susan answered in the chat already about the Cleveland Clinic and their female surgery. But it occurs to me that for you, Susan, and also for Carol, that both of your work is now controversial. I mean, for Carol, this is about the restitution of so many objects back to their own country, to Polynesia, and of course to Africa as well. So I don't know if you want to speak about those issues, or people on the, if our authors want to also talk about how they came up with their presentations, or maybe if it's out of a larger book or work that they're doing. So anyone, Susan, you looked like you were about to say something about, oh, sorry.
No, not at all. I was just acknowledging the fact that it's always controversial when you're talking about women's bodies, especially about women's genitalia. And one of the things that I have found really important to do in this article was to demystify that process so that we don't exoticize it any more than necessary, whether it's for European women or African women. I do also want to point out that European women, American women, and even Australian women to a certain extent, in those societies, we are comfortable with male circumcision, and frequently babies are circumcised at birth or a few days afterwards, but it's not considered appropriate to do that to women. And in other situations, we find that women's sort of genital modifications, whether they're on young girls or on adult women, is very divided as to how women and how men feel about these issues, but also how women feel about other women doing this. And so that's another thing I wanted to address in the chapter that I talk about, is sort of the way we can unpack this issue via these museum objects, because this is where that conversation is happening as a result of those sculptures. Carol, I do think it's actually important for the restitution issue that you talk about that, and I could just say ditto for a lot of African objects. So do you want to address that for us?
The restitution issue is extremely difficult for the Marquesas because they don't have facilities that would be acceptable to bring objects for the sake of conservation and state security and that kind of thing. The closest place is Tahiti, which is 1,000 miles away, and they're part of French Polynesia, they all are, so they travel back and forth all the time. But, I think it's not something that's going to happen very quickly with French Polynesia. And the one thing about it is that because they are French, they do travel frequently to France. And because they've traveled frequently to France, and I mean many people, they do have opportunities to see the objects. And the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris has a very strong connection with Tahiti and welcomes people coming. And so that's about the best at this point. I think for me, one of the things to answer Brima's question, but thank you, Susan, for tossing that to me. I appreciate that. I think for me, working with Marquesan people and with Marquesan history and culture, one of the things that motivates me is to try and make it clear that these were real people. The anonymity that Susan talked about with artists and with, who were these people in these paintings or whatever. I think it's really important that we connect it and make them real. And if you read the chapter, I have a lot of, we know so much about these women. It's amazing. And, I really hope that sharing that knowledge will help to bring people to realize that we're all the same. There's so much in common with everybody everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any of our authors like to comment about their work? I know, not to put Diane on the spot, but she has a book coming out related to this, so maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I actually wanted to piggyback on what Carol said.
Oh, sorry.
Because I had to cut out of the paper some of the things that we know about Alice George, namely that she had 10 sons and 5 daughters. She had 39 grandchildren. Her favorite foods were cheese, bread, butter, ale, and roasting pig. So even though this is a woman who lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago and a working class woman, we still know an amazing amount about her. But yes, this is a part of a book that's in press now with Yale University Press on servants and slaves in Western Europe from around, actually, it also includes some African art, some American art, Chinese. And I should say it's a little more global, but I'm talking too much. 1400 to 1700. I did also, I know I talk a lot, but I did want to address one point Susan Cart said, which is to bring in male circumcision, because certainly I get a lot of pushback from my students about that. I really think that these are two very different surgical operations that have very different consequences for the people getting them. But, this is a huge political discussion, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. What about the audience? You have questions that you would like to raise? You can just raise your hand using the reactions and your hand will come up and then we'll be able to see it, I think. Or you can just unmute yourself and shout out.
Mm-hmm.
Prima, there's actually an interesting question in the chat from Katerina Pierre. It goes back a little bit, but it's about the current US culture of complete resistance of aging with the rise in the availability of things like cool sculpting, Botox, etc. I wonder if the image of the natural woman of a certain age will be embraced eventually or will be completely denigrated in the future. I think it's sort of interesting to contemplate that and whether this book might enlighten some people about new ways of thinking about aging in our current culture of obsession with youth.
Well, that certainly would be a positive outcome. And I think the variety of all of your topics and the media, it just, I think, so refreshing to see these different points of view. And it's not all positive or all negative, but that there's a richness in the entire topic. So I think, yes, I would hope that people would certainly rethink it. And but meanwhile, while they're not, we should just enjoy it. I'm one of those grandmothers, so I can do what I want.
Thanks for the question, though, Katerina.
There was a recent article in the Times about, because of the pandemic, more women are letting their hair go gray. I mean, my hair's been gray for about 10 years. I didn't need a pandemic, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. See that Paul's hand is up.
Thank you. I just wanted to acknowledge again the perseverance and leadership and give appropriate thanks to Midori and especially to Frema, who, as she said, initiated this project back in 2010 at a CAA session. And some of us were there. And that was really a wonderful session. It sparked the idea, I think, for the book, but it's been a long journey through the landscape, the changing landscape of art history publishing. But I just want to thank both of you for your perseverance and your leadership, and especially to you, Frema, for your own research. And you didn't speak on your own work today, but your own groundbreaking research on the area that I talked about, Judith Leister. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Paul. And to answer questions that haven't been asked, I agree with Paul's analysis of the older Judith Leister. So I will actually say that. And yes, Ruth, I really did mean it when I said I would babysit to get you to finish writing your chapter.
I mean, that is so relevant.
I'd forgotten that I did, but I did.
Thank you.
Midori, do you want to just wrap up if we have no more questions, or if there's somebody else in the audience or any of our speakers would like to address the public? I'm so pleased that so many, nearly 90 people have been part of our audience here. So that's really pretty terrific.
Yes, I wonder if we have maybe question to each other or another of, but just to say that I also really appreciate it to be brought into this whole project from as a contributor and then co-editor. So I really thank Freema for that.
Oh, thank you. I don't know that we would have finished it without your help, Midori. It was just getting a little unwieldy. So thank you. Maybe we should, in fact, just simply thank everyone and end for this evening. I think there is a notice about the discount if you want to purchase the book, and certainly like to thank all our authors for being here.
Thank you, everybody.
So
Thank you.
Midori will tell about the discount, and then I'd like to do some thank yous and some upcoming events. So
Yes, I will put that same link on the chat so that can be copied. Thank you.
awesome. I'd like to, Midori and Freema, you are amazing. All of the speakers this evening, it's so exciting. I think we have a hand up from Merle. Do you want to ask a question?
So I'm wondering how we can broadly advertise the book. I think it has just a tremendous wide range of interest in a lot of different disciplines and in general. How do we get the word out?
What a great question.
Yeah, we're not sure, but if you have ideas, or if you would like to buy like the first 1,000 copies or something like that.
But Freema, it is planned to be converted to paperback, right? So it'll become
Yes.
more available.
I think in about 6 months, and then it will be much more affordable too.
So maybe
Do
we
you
can have
know
another event.
Do you know of any general publications that are reviewing it?
We know who we sent a list. I mean, there's Midori and I sent a
Yeah.
list to Bloomsbury, but it's not clear what they have done with it. So far, we haven't seen any outside reviews. I mean, or at least they haven't let us know. So I don't know. I see Katerina Pierre wants to mention.
Yes, Women's Art Journal is in works, yeah, and
good.
CAA reviews.
Okay, well, thanks, Merle, for that question.
Awesome, thanks, Merle.
Yeah.
I want to thank Anna Carhart, our theater manager, Justin Tinker, our technical director, Sabrina Sabalo, our box office manager, and Zoom, amazing coordinator. And I'd like Anna to show us some of the upcoming events, and then we'll have a little party. On November 13th, we have an amazing band coming from Korea, Akdong Gwangchil, ADG7. So we hope that you can join us for that. Then November 12th through the 21st, we have Sweeney Todd, just in time for Halloween. So you can, not for kids, but for all of the rest of us. And on November 16th, we have blues artist Guy Davis. And then we will round out our music programs on December 4th and 5th with a Winter Jazz Festival. Midori, you have things in the gallery still. So please have people come and visit our galleries. Anything to announce about that?
Yes, we have Amanda Thackley's exhibition Surface Tension until the end of semester, and then the other gallery has turned over already and getting ready for next show, Wonder Woman project. It's a short residency program of actually women who are meeting virtually, I think this time, to produce the work concerning health this year. Thank you for giving a moment, Stephanie.
Absolutely. So you can find out all of the events on njcu.edu/arts.